Okay, so Valence, you argue that there's no such thing as an off-the-shelf AI agent. So what are organizations getting wrong when they try to deploy what we might call plug and play agentic tools?
Yeah, I mean, a generic agent dropped into an enterprise is really just like a confident stranger with access to all the sweets in the candy shop. I think an agent, in its basis terms, is just a microservice, really. But the AIs and the reasoning agent, reasoning LLMs offer just give you so much more capability. And so the market has sold an agent as a product, but really, if you think about it in enterprise terms, it's much more of an architecture. The tech, the orchestrations, the patterns, and things like that is largely solved. It's very, very mature, surprisingly, given how new the term is, because it's coming from the microservices architecture. But the wrapper around it, that intelligence that an enterprise needs, that's what's missing. And where if you go for a plug and play model, it's missing. It's assuming that the building is already wired. It's not actually, that's not actually the case. The raw data is raw data. And that failure mode, those agents just making things up, it's silent and it's actually worse than broken. So if you try and plug and play an agent, you're going to get into trouble very, very quickly.
Okay, but clearly boards are under immense pressure to adopt AI quickly, of fear of missing out, if nothing else. I mean, how is this urgency leading companies to invest in agents that don't actually align with, how their business operates or the business needs?
Panic is real. I think the leadership in these big and then mid-sized companies as well, they're seeing their peers grow and roll out AI and agentic architectures and so on and so forth. And they want to get onto that bandwagon. They're reading these tech and these vendor reports and going back to their tech teams and back to their leadership teams and saying, we need AI, we need it now, we need it quick. And that pressure is starting from the board, but not on the engineering floor. And so the risk of obsolescence, that anxiety, gets quickly converted into, it gets converted into a procurement decision. And when a vendor arrives with an answer to questions that the business hadn't really thought about yet, then technology is scraping, trying to find an answer that's going to keep the CEO and the leadership happy. You know what a leader reads in a McKinsey deck on a flight from Heathrow is something that a CTO is being tasked to defend, but there's no roadmap. There's nothing that can be stress tested behind the scenes, and it's really very, very difficult to actually justify that change without any thought behind it. I think
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
outsourcing your roadmap to a vendor's pitch in that case.
so you emphasize the importance of the enterprise intelligence stack beneath the agent layer. So thoughts as to how organizations need to think about defining truth, decision logic, risk governance before they even touch agents. So to your point, obviously, actually working out what they want to do before they start looking at agents and acquisition.
Yeah, I mean that's true. You can't give an agent autonomy over a system when it doesn't understand the concepts within that system, when those definitions haven't been agreed upon, then you're going to really struggle. If you want to try to understand a system, you've got to define that system. You've got to understand that the language that's being used, why this thing means one thing to one part of the business and means a slightly different thing to another part of the business. And you've got to understand that holistically across the entire enterprise. The stack is sequential in my view. I think you've got to understand the raw data, what is there. You've got to understand what that means within the context of the enterprise, the nouns and the verbs that describe the entities within the business. Then you've got to understand, how that data flows from the raw data to the contextualized data, the composed data, the schema. And then you've got to actually figure out what it actually means to that business, what governed metrics are there, what decisions were made, and how that is surfaced within the various different areas of the business. And then you've got to have a trust layer. You can't just have the raw data and the raw semantics and then operate upon it without thinking, should we, and who should as well. So if you kind of ask sales, if you ask finance, you ask operations, what a concept as amorphous as revenue means, you probably get three different answers for the same exact words. And then until that disagreement is reconciled, until it's been disambiguated by the semantic layer, every agent that comes in trying to reason about revenue, it's going to confidently produce a mutually contradictory answer, depending on which context it's working in. And it's going to be very confident in that answer as well. So agents really don't surface the architectural incoherence. They actually amplify it, but at machine speed, which is more dangerous than an individual amplifying that because they're naturally slower.
So I think you probably partly answered the next question, but I'll ask anyway. Why do generic agents tend to fail in real enterprise environments, even when the underlying technology is potentially strong? Is it just because they don't understand the context, or is there more going on, if you like?
Yeah, the model is strong and the patterns being used for those enterprises are strong. It's well understood. It's just a software engineering problem at the end of the day. But the world it's reasoning over, that's what's not been described. And so if you don't describe that world that these agents are reasoning over, they're going to come up with answers that don't make sense. There's no persistent if there's no persistent memory, then it needs to be learning every single time. It needs to be making the same thought processes every single time, and it's going to be subtly different every single time. There's no predictability. Without those grounded definitions, the agent will invent its own naturally. That failure will show up in production, not in demos, because the demos will be well constrained and so on. They need to wow. I think it's one way to think about it is if you think about a rally driver, the driver himself or herself is extremely accomplished. They know how to control the car, they know how to get from A to B. But they actually, if they get thrown into a new route without having gone down that route with the co-driver, figuring out what the next turn is going to look like, what the jump is going to look like, and so forth, they're going to crash the car. And so that intelligence layer is someone having run the route before, so that you can give it to a very, very accomplished driver, the agent, to actually navigate that route successfully and fast. Again, analogous to an agent, which is going to be fast as well.
Yeah, and you point out that no two companies share the same operational context. So, what are the most overlooked variables that make each organization's agentic needs fundamentally different?
It's quite an interesting question, um, in that when you compare two businesses in the same sort of vertical next to each other, they ostensibly look the same from the outside, but every single one is subtly different. They have slightly different ways of working, slightly different interpretations of the same sort of concepts, within that vertical as well. They still operate against different versions of the truth. That gap is invisible in a vendor demo when you're trying to demonstrate the capabilities of a particular verticalized piece of software. It's going to be verticalized against the lowest common denominator. It'll actually that difference, those differences will only really show up when you get an agent trying to work within the confines of that particular enterprise's MO, that particular enterprise's way of working. So that false equivalence is the trap. It's the same vertical, it's the same ERP, it's the same demo, and it does look like the same problem, but the variables that diverge, they're invisible. They are hidden until you actually get into the put into production, when you start seeing the real impact of real world scenarios coming at the software, decision rights, data lineage, regulatory shape, and so on. I liken it to a retailer, a retail vertical. On the face of it, it looks very, very similar. But if you have two retailers, they may have a different interpretation of what a returned item looks like. In one retailer, that returned item might signify a closed transaction. In the second retailer, It might treat that returned item as an open relationship, for an upsell, a cross sell, or a marketing opportunity to same data, but a different ontology, a different meaning behind the concepts, behind that raw data, which also then leads on to a different agent behavior. You put the same off-the-shelf agent, like back to our first point, you put that same off-the-shelf agent into that same scenario, you will get something that works for one of those retailers, but does not work for the other of those retailers. Or in the worst case scenario, it works for neither of the retailers because they're just subtly different, too subtly different. And that vendor demo work because they cover the lowest common denominator, but every single enterprise's pitch, every single enterprise is operating model is subtly unique, and you cannot adhere to the opinion of a vendor if you want to maintain your way of working. That's a failure mode.
So, ontologies, which I think you mentioned just now, ontologies emerging as a critical enabler for enterprise grade AI. How do they unlock capabilities that the current agentic platforms just can't deliver on their own?
Yeah, ontologies is a buzzword that's growing a little bit of traction in the market at the moment. A lot of the major um, manufacturers, Microsoft, Google's, and so on and so forth, are starting to bring their own forms of these ontologies, maybe called as a semantic layer or what have you. Then they're bringing them to the table, and that ontology, I think, is the difference between an agent that has access to one that gives it more understanding. The agent that doesn't have access to one has a thin veneer of understanding. It thinks it knows what it's talking about, but one that does have access to one has actual understanding. It's the world model of the business, typed objects, its relationships, its actions that are proven to align to the business's way of working, to their target operating model. That access without understanding is just retrieval. It's just getting data from A to B and doing no thinking about it, doing no reasoning about it. That retrieval really has a ceiling, but the ontology grading reason does not, and it allows you to have emergent characteristics off the back of it. Do you think about a CRM, for example, that doesn't store customer, does not store just customer relationship. It just stores rows. It just stores raw data at its most basic. The ontology tells the enterprise what actually is the meaning of this row of data, those flags, and that with this history and so on. It tells the business as a whole that this particular row in the database is a strategic account that's in trouble because of these characteristics. I think most platforms are shipping that search engine, they've been able to interrogate the raw data, and they call that the schema. They call that the master data model, or whatever you want to call it, that data centralization, whatever you want to call it. But that category error, that'll cost, and that'll take years to unpick if you're operating agents on top of that.
Yeah, so maybe just picking up on that point, because clearly lots of organizations still see agents as a shortcut to automation, but there's clearly a massive risk in deploying agents without first building this coherent intelligence architecture. I mean, how you said can, I think just then it can take years to unpick. So how potentially catastrophic is it to sort of put the cart before the horse, if that's the right analogy?
I mean, it's so hyperbolic. A lot of the content that's coming out about agents and so on. I don't think it's ungrounded. And I must admit, I think the speed of compute and the power of the language models with the reasoning layers on top of them means that speed without the underlying architecture is technical debt with autonomy. You've got these agents compounding the confidence that they're bringing without actually any grounding in the reality of the enterprise in which they're operating. That automation without the architecture compounds at that compute speed. So however much compute you put at it, it's just going to compound and compound and compound. That compounding error is something I think it's gaining a bit of traction. The misalignment argument is gaining traction, but that misalignment, that compounding error rates, they get very, very high very, very quickly if you chain agents without any underlying guardrails behind the scenes. So the pilot's not the cost. The pilot is often showcasing a capability that's real. It's aligning to a workflow. It's ticking a very, very niche box. The operational debt that's left behind when that pilot goes into production, that's where the cost is. Reversing a deployed agent that's been in production, that's been compounding these errors and compounding this data, if it's got right back, oh, then that's going to start that cost is going to compound more and more the longer you leave it, and it's going to start later than it should have as well. So architecture first looks slower at the beginning, but it's much, much faster over time. And there's various quotes out there, bad architecture costs, I'm sorry, good architecture costs a lot of money, but bad architecture costs a lot more.
And do you think most of these sort of surveys I get indicate that the majority of folks are underwhelmed with the results of their AI sort of projects to date? And what you've been talking about, do you think that's the fundamental, or certainly one of the major reasons why people are disappointed because they haven't put the framework in place before they start using agentic AI?
I mean, pouring the foundations after the building is already up just wouldn't make sense in, physical architecture. It just you think, well, why have you done that? It's just going to break. And so this is very similar in my view, that you can't build the windows and the doors and the fancy air conditioning and things like that in a building that has no foundations. I think that's what we're seeing in enterprise AI adoption right now, is people are trying to have the shiny agent that does very, very impressive things in a demo context and have that run in production without having a foundational strata upon which to actually build those agents on top of. I mean, you've got to think in terms of the foundations of the business, before you start thinking in terms of the shiny, fun, wow, this is amazing concepts.
So yeah, so looking ahead, I mean, do you see a positive future in terms of how the relationship between agents, ontologies, and enterprise decision making is going to evolve over the next couple of years? Do you think people are, as you say, there's beginning to be discussions around this, or are you slightly worried that people will continue to be impressed, as you say, but with the bells and whistles of the demo and not necessarily understand what needs to be done before they deploy in a production environment?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean predictions in this market age extremely badly. I think it's fair to say what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years. I mean, it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 days at the moment. So I think it's worth focusing on the pattern rather than any sort of predictions. I think what used to be a 3-year plan is actually occurring in 3 months. And these days, enterprises really need to move fast to maintain relevance, and the technology needs to move fast to maintain relevance. I think the question that the market's asking, it does shift year on year, day on day, month on month, but it's the same sort of shape, but there's a different layer of the stack each time. If you turn and think of it in terms of phases that an enterprise should be asking themselves. The phase one would have been, do you have agents? And that was answered relatively quickly. We can go back to our CEO reading the latest tech report and panicking and getting the CTO to try and address that. But phase two then asks the common data question. Are those agents integrated with our data? And if there's a direct relationship between the agent and the data, many enterprises think, tick, we've got an agentic architecture and we're with the times. But phase three really lands on, are those agents reasoning against the same definitions? Not reasoning about data, because that's phase two. Are they reasoning about the same definitions? If there's an answer of yes to all three of those, then yeah, you have a digital twin, you have an ontology, you have an intelligence platform that you can work on, an ontologically backed enterprise. Fantastic. If the answer is yes to only the first two, back to our CEO, CTO panic question, we need AI, then actually what you've got is hallucination at scale. Nobody's aligned, not the individuals, the human knowledge capital working within the business, nor the agentic compute working within the business. And really, it's going to be compounding the errors, compounding the hallucinations, because that hallucination is going to be written back into the data substrate. And it's going to be very, very painful to unpick that over time. I think once they realize that automation has to run against data that actually means something to the business, you recognize that the order is non-negotiable. You cannot skip that third step of reasoning against the same definitions, the ontology, the semantics. You've got to have it in that right order. Otherwise, you're going to get into massive operational and technical debt very quickly.
And just finally, what is it that your own organization, where do you fit in within the landscape that we've been talking about? What do you bring to the party?
So we've positioned ourselves as a consultancy that does, we think about these problems, but we think about the use case within a business, and we think about ways to solve those use cases. And the best way to solve those use cases and understanding how the tacit and institutional knowledge is captured, and then build that up through an intelligence platform, figuring out what the enterprise, what data that it has, what it means, what exists, how it means, what it means to the business, how it can be used, and should it be used in that way? Who should use it as well? So these sort of questions, this capability, understanding of the capability and the concerns of the enterprise before we even deploy or think about building an agent to operate upon it, understanding the enterprise from the ground up, and then codifying that into a semantic understanding that both humans and agents can reason against. That's the most important thing that we bring to the table.
And also, actually, I'm just sorry, one other thing occurs to me. In terms of the definitions, you said, I think you used the example of revenue, that, the definition of that could be completely different for different departments within a business. And I'm sure there are other such words or phrases. So how difficult and how do you overcome that? Do you have to end up using different words in different departments so that, because presumably, as you say, the agentic AI, if it just sees that word, it'll have one way of, addressing it, as opposed to the subtleties of three or four different definitions. So is it quite a complicated process to almost build up a dictionary of definitions across the enterprise?
Yeah, that glossary is the key. So the ontology defines what exists within the enterprise. What exists is sometimes different to the data that's behind the scene. What they have, and that canonicalization of the data, the one definition that means the same thing to everyone is what's defined at that ontology. As you get through the semantics, the lens by which you surface what exists in the system is contextualized by who's looking at it. And so when finance come and look at the semantic understanding of revenue, it's contextualized by who's looking at it. And so you need to have a canonical version of the data. So this is where finance systems, the ERP system may have one piece of raw data that means revenue, and operations may have another piece of raw data that means revenue. That needs to be canonicalized into the ontology layer, and then it needs to be semanticalized into the meat that had meaning added to it when it gets further up the stack. And so those layering, and this is why the layering is so important. You can't just interrogate the ontology, because you'll still have three different meanings for the same word. That's why you need that semantic layer on top of it.
Well, it's been brilliant to chat, and thank you so much for sharing so many great insights into what's obviously a fast-moving
Really is.
landscape. Really appreciate it, Don. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Appreciate it. Thank you.